Did you know the rise of Hindu extremism in India has become a major problem, not only within the country but also for neighboring Southeast Asia? The spread of Hindutva, an ideology rooted in Hindu nationalism, has gained significant traction, with organizations such as the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh (RSS), the Bharatiya Janata Party (BJP), ISKCON, and Hindu Sena at the forefront of this movement. These groups are promoting a vision of India where Hinduism dominates, marginalizing religious minorities, and undermining the secular fabric of the nation. In this video, we will explore how the growing power of Hindu extremism in India is becoming a significant threat to peace and harmony across Southeast Asia, and why the situation demands serious attention. So let's dive into it. India, often touted as a rising power, has alienated itself from its neighbors through a toxic combination of arrogance, aggression, and incompetence. Far from being the leader it claims to be, India's overbearing foreign policy, driven by self-interest and hegemonic ambitions, has destabilized the region and left it increasingly isolated. Smaller South Asian nations like Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, and the Maldives now view India less as a partner and more as a bully, a nation that imposes its will while ignoring the sovereignty and dignity of others. With rising Hindu extremism and chronic domestic issues, India's standing as a regional leader looks increasingly hollow. India's Big Brother syndrome. India's attitude toward its neighbors reflects a deep-rooted sense of condescension and domination. Rather than fostering relationships based on mutual respect and cooperation, India consistently uses its size and power to impose its will, disregarding the unique needs and aspirations of smaller nations. Take Bangladesh, for example. India has repeatedly failed to address key issues such as the Teesta River water sharing agreement and the Farakka Dam dispute, issues that have left millions of Bangladeshis facing severe environmental and economic risks. Rather than resolving these critical matters, India has shown little concern for the well-being of its neighbor, treating Bangladesh's concerns as secondary. The country has also supported a controversial regime under Sheikh Hasina, widely perceived as a puppet government, while consistently failing to reciprocate Bangladesh's significant cooperation in counter-terrorism efforts and trade. Furthermore, India's approach to Bangladesh has often veered into the realm of interference. Instead of respecting Bangladesh's sovereignty, India has waged a covert media war, meddling in its internal politics and fueling tensions, including religious conflicts between Hindus and Muslims. The Research and Analysis Wing, RAW, has actively played a role in manipulating Bangladesh's internal affairs, undermining the country's democratic processes, and creating a hostile atmosphere. This kind of destabilizing interference has only bred resentment, pushing Bangladesh further away from India and reducing the prospects for any meaningful partnership. Nepal, another close neighbor, has also borne the brunt of India's high-handedness. The 2015 economic blockade, imposed by India during Nepal's constitutional crisis, caused widespread suffering and exposed New Delhi's willingness to use its influence as a weapon. This act of aggression has driven Nepal closer to China, a move that further isolates India. In Sri Lanka and the Maldives, India's meddling in domestic politics has created lasting resentment. New Delhi's attempts to control these nations' foreign and domestic policies have only pushed them to seek alternative partnerships, primarily with China, which offers assistance without interference. Hindu extremism, a threat to regional stability. Under its current political leadership, India has embraced a divisive and exclusionary form of nationalism, best exemplified by the rise of Hindutva, an ideology that prioritizes Hindu supremacy over the country's secular foundations. This shift has increasingly marginalized religious minorities, particularly Muslims, who are often treated as second-class citizens. The rise of Hindu extremism in India is not only a domestic issue, but one that has profound implications for regional stability, undermining India's credibility as a responsible regional leader. Since the 1990s, the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, with its ideological roots in the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, has stoked tensions between Hindus and Muslims, often through provocative rhetoric and policies. The country has witnessed numerous Hindu-Muslim riots, fueled by extremist elements within the ruling party's support base. These events have deepened communal divides, contributing to a climate of fear and suspicion, and the erosion of India's identity as a secular democracy. The consequences of this extremist agenda extend beyond India's borders. India's neighbors, particularly Bangladesh, have been directly impacted by India's Hindu nationalist policies. The BJP-led government's treatment of Muslims within India and its aggressive stance toward Bangladesh have strained diplomatic relations. Issues such as the Citizenship Amendment Act, CA, which grants citizenship to non-Muslim refugees but excludes Muslims, have caused alarm in Muslim-majority Bangladesh. The fear of a potential refugee crisis or mass deportations has led to growing skepticism in Dhaka regarding India's intentions. India's treatment of Bangladesh, particularly under the influence of Hindu extremism, has further complicated the relationship. While India sees Bangladesh as a smaller neighbor to dominate, many in Bangladesh perceive this as an infringement on their sovereignty. The failure to resolve long-standing issues such as the Teesta River water-sharing dispute and the Farakka Dam have left millions in Bangladesh vulnerable, and India's lack of genuine engagement on these matters has reinforced the perception that India treats Bangladesh as a subordinate state rather than an equal sovereign entity. This aggressive nationalism and disregard for neighborly cooperation not only alienate India's closest allies, but also undermine its credibility as a democratic and secular state. The alarming rise in Hindu extremism has caused many smaller countries in the region to question India's capacity to lead responsibly. As India becomes increasingly dominated by a singular, exclusionary ideology, its role as a regional leader is in jeopardy. Neighboring nations, once hopeful for stronger regional integration, are now increasingly wary of India's intentions and are seeking alternative alliances, most notably with China, which offers economic cooperation without the ideological imposition seen from New Delhi. Ultimately, Hindu extremism is driving a wedge between India and its neighbors, eroding its position in South Asia. If this trend continues, India risks not only alienating its neighbors, but also diminishing its influence on the global stage. Economic exploitation and self-inflicted isolation. India's economic policies towards its neighbors reflect a pattern of exploitation and neglect. Rather than promoting regional economic integration, India imposes trade barriers that disproportionately harm smaller economies. Bangladesh, for example, faces restrictions on exporting its products to India, even as India demands favorable access to Bangladeshi markets. This one-sided approach has prompted Bangladesh to diversify its trade partnerships, strengthening ties with China, the European Union, and Southeast Asia. India's short-sighted policies have also backfired domestically. For example, the ban on cattle exports to Bangladesh forced the country to develop its own livestock industry, achieving near self-sufficiency and reducing its reliance on India. Similarly, India's failure to provide a stable supply of essential goods like onions has encouraged its neighbors to invest in local production, further diminishing India's economic leverage. The irony of India's superpower claims. India's self-proclaimed status as a regional and global superpower is a facade, contradicted by its glaring domestic and international failures. Despite its aspirations for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, India struggles with basic developmental challenges. Over 65% of its population lacks access to proper sanitation, and millions live below the poverty line. These shortcomings undermine India's credibility as a leader capable of addressing regional and global issues. Moreover, India's aggressive behavior has isolated it in its own backyard. Countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka are increasingly turning to China for economic and strategic support, seeing Beijing as a more reliable partner. This shift exposes India's declining influence and raises questions about its ability to maintain relevance in South Asia. China's growing influence. A consequence of India's failures have created a vacuum that China has been quick to fill. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, China has established itself as a dominant player in South Asia, offering infrastructure investments and economic aid without the strings attached by India. From Sri Lanka's Hambantota port to Nepal's connectivity projects and Bangladesh's power plants, China's presence in the region is undeniable. Unlike India, which relies on coercion and dominance, China has built relationships based on mutual benefit, further eroding India's standing. India's inability to counter China's influence is a direct result of its misguided policies. Rather than focusing on collaboration and partnership, India's aggressive tactics have alienated its neighbors, leaving it increasingly isolated in a region that should have been its sphere of influence. A path of no return? India's current trajectory is unsustainable. Its arrogance, aggression, and inability to adapt to changing regional dynamics have left it on the brink of irrelevance. If India hopes to reverse this trend, it must abandon its hegemonic mindset and embrace a more cooperative approach. This requires treating its neighbors as equals, addressing their concerns with sincerity, and prioritizing shared growth over domination. Failing this, India risks not only further isolation but also a significant loss of influence in South Asia, as its neighbors continue to look elsewhere for partnership and support. India's aggressive and domineering policies have backfired spectacularly, undermining its credibility as a regional leader and alienating its neighbors. As smaller nations increasingly align with China, India's isolation in South Asia becomes more pronounced, exposing the hollowness of its claims to regional and global leadership. If India does not change course, it will find itself not as a leader, but as an outsider in its own neighborhood, a cautionary tale of how arrogance and aggression can lead to self-inflicted decline.